This video is on Chapter 2, focusing on sensation and perception. Contact information is also provided here for the assistance professor who created this video. This chapter covers sensation and the senses, the meaning of perception, perceptual organization, depth and distance perception, perceptual constancy and illusions, and extrasensory perception. Psychological life begins with knowing what is happening around us. Sensation and perception are the first important dimensions, supplying the data for learning, remembering, thinking, problem-solving, communicating, and experiencing emotions. Sensation is the process by which sense organs receive, convert, and transmit a stimulus from the environment to the brain. A stimulus is any change in outside energy that arouses a sense organ and its receptors. Sensory receptors are specialized cells in the sense organs that detect and respond to stimuli, like light, sound, and odors. They convert these stimuli into neural impulses. This image illustrates the overall process of sensation and perception, showing the steps from the stimulus to the brain's interpretation. Transduction is the process of converting stimulus energy into neural impulses. This allows the nervous system to interpret the information. This slide further emphasizes the concept of transduction, the conversion of sensory input into signals the brain can understand. Sensation and perception differ in that sensation is largely about receiving and transmitting sensory input, while perception organizes and interprets those sensations into meaningful patterns. The two processes are interconnected and hard to separate in daily life. To understand how sensation works, we consider the sensory laws. These include the concepts of sensory threshold and sensory adaptation. Sensory threshold is the minimum intensity a sensation can be detected. This is explained through the law of absolute threshold and the law of difference threshold. The absolute threshold, or Lyman, is the minimum amount of stimulation required for a person to detect a stimulus. It is the smallest intensity that must be present to be detected. The absolute threshold is the smallest amount of energy needed to consciously detect a stimulus 50% of the time. Anything less than this goes unnoticed. This image visually represents the concept of the absolute threshold, where stimulation must reach a certain level to be detected. Factors influencing the absolute threshold include the intensity of the stimulus and the individual's physical and psychological state, such as their response bias. Subliminal perception occurs when stimuli are below one's absolute threshold for conscious awareness. They are strong enough to activate sensory receptors but not strong enough for conscious recognition. The difference threshold, or just noticeable difference, JND, is the smallest amount of change needed in a stimulus before a difference is detected. Weber's law, computed by Ernst Weber, states that the change needed to detect a difference is proportional to the original intensity of the stimulus. More intense stimuli require more change to notice a difference. Sensory adaptation is the tendency of sensory receptor cells to become less responsive to an unchanging stimulus. Sensory overload happens when there is too much sensory input to process effectively. This slide provides a summary of the concepts covered so far: sensation, sensory receptors, transduction, sensory adaptation, sensory overload, sensory thresholds, and Weber's law.
The next section covers perceptual organization and top-down processing, which involves how we structure and make sense of sensory input.
Bottom-up processing moves from individual elements to the whole, like processing sensory input to recognition. Top-down processing is conceptually driven, moving from the whole to the elements, and is influenced by experience and context. This diagram illustrates the flow from sensation to perception, incorporating both bottom-up and top-down processing. Perception is the selection, organization, and interpretation of sensory input. It is characterized by selectivity, organization, and constancy. Selectivity in perception means we attend to only a few events around us. Attention divides perception into a clearly perceived focus and a dimly perceived margin. It is influenced by external and internal factors. External factors that attract attention include intensity and size, contrast, repetition, movement, and novelty or newness in the environment. Internal factors influencing attention include motives, such as needs and interests, set or expectancy, and the context in which an event appears. Attention is determined by both external factors of the stimuli and internal psychological states, which determine readiness to attend. This slide summarizes the concepts of perception, from sensation to perception, selectivity and attention, and external and internal factors. Organization in perception groups visual elements for meaning. The concept is that the whole is different from the sum of its parts. Gestalt principles of perception emphasize that perception is an active creation, not just adding up pieces. Organizing tendencies include figure-ground perception, grouping, closure, proximity, similarity, and continuity. Figure and ground perception organizes a scene into the object of interest, the figure, against the background, the ground. This occurs in senses beyond vision as well. Similarity is the tendency to group elements with similar features together. Proximity is the grouping of elements that are closer together in space or time. Closure involves filling in gaps in stimulation to perceive a whole object. Continuity is the preference to see smooth contours instead of abrupt changes in direction. Constancy in perception is the tendency to perceive objects as stable, despite changing sensory information. This includes size, shape, and brightness constancy. This slide summarizes Gestalt psychology, figure ground, similarity and proximity, closure and continuity, and constancy in perception. The visual cliff experiment by Eleanor Gibson showed that human infants, and even newborn animals, have depth perception. Perceiving depth and distance is the ability to recognize distances and three-dimensionality using visual cues. These cues are categorized as binocular cues, using both eyes, or monocular cues, using a single eye. Monocular cues, used with one eye, include linear perspective, relative size, interposition, texture gradient, height in plane, and shadowing.
This slide provides visual examples of monocular cues, such as linear perspective, interposition, relative size, texture gradient, and shadowing. Linear perspective is when parallel lines moving away from the viewer appear to converge. Texture gradient makes textures appear denser and less distinct as distance increases. Interposition means that nearer objects overlap and mask those further away. Relative size suggests that if objects are expected to be the same size, the larger ones are perceived as closer. Height in the visual plane indicates that near objects are lower in the field of vision, while distant objects are higher up. Light and shadow patterns create the impression of three-dimensional forms. Binocular cues involve clues about distance, based on the different views of the two eyes. Retinal disparity is the difference between the images seen by each eye, which increases as an object gets closer. Convergence is a neuromuscular cue where the eyes move inward to focus on near objects and outward for distant objects. This cue aids the brain in calculating distance.